But tonight we're going to focus on what we are calling the turbulent neighborhood of South Asia. The world is in a critical phase in the backdrop of what's happened with the Russia-Ukraine war coming out of a pandemic. A prolonged conflict is dealing a huge blow to the global economy, but in our neighborhood itself, two countries in serious pain. Inflation has pushed Pakistan into a corner as one of the many reasons why Imran Khan is on his way out. The Sri Lankan economy is on the verge of collapse, and there too, the government of Rajapaksa is facing massive street protests and unrest at this moment, a country in turmoil. On the other hand, India may appear to be relatively stable. But today, the Reserve Bank of India cut the growth forecast for the current fiscal to 7.2%. India, though, will still be among the fastest growing economies of the world. How insulated is India from the storms that are gathering around us? Tonight, we'll have economists from Sri Lanka, Pakistan and India joining us to give us a sense of that. But first, take a look at the storm that probably awaits large parts of the world, including South Asia, an economy that is heading towards troubled times. Take a look.
The Reserve Bank of India keeps the repo rate unchanged at 4%. A rate announced on May 22, 2020 to spur demand in view of the pandemic. But it has sounded a note of caution as well. The central bank has cut growth forecast for the current fiscal from 7.8% to 7.2%. And it has raised inflation forecast from 4.5% to 5.7%. The forecast assumes crude oil trades at $100 a barrel.
According to the second advance estimates released by the National Statistics Office, NSO, on February 28, real GDP rose by 8.9% in 21-22. Private consumption and fixed investment, key drivers of the domestic demand, however, remain subdued.
Economists warn the picture could be troubling if the Ukraine war turns out to be prolonged. While the prognosis may make you wary, the glass in fact is half full. A recent IMF paper written by Surjit Bhalla, Arvind Virmani and Karan Bhasin has pegged the population living in extreme poverty in terms of purchasing power parity at 0.9%. The study says this was made possible by the free food distribution during the pandemic. India has managed to keep economy on track at a time when countries in the neighborhood are grappling with high inflation. In Pakistan, a price rise is forcing a possible exit of Prime Minister Imran Khan. While in Sri Lanka, the Rajapaksas, who ruled with an iron hand, are on a verge of exit. India's fundamentals remain strong, which means the country is better placed to tackle the raging global inflation. With Ashwarya Paliwal, Bureau Report, India Today.
So let's raise that big question tonight. Is India an oasis of stability in this turbulent region? Can India show South Asia the way? Or are there lessons that India will also need to learn from what's going on in our neighborhood, Pakistan, and in particular in Sri Lanka? I'll be joined in a moment by Nadeemul Haq, Vice Chancellor, Pakistan Institute of Development Economics in Islamabad. I'm joined at this moment by Soumya Kanti Ghosh, Group Chief Economic Advisor, State Bank of India. Dr. Ahilan Kadir Gamar, Political Economist, Colombo, also joins us. Appreciate all of you joining us. Let me come to you, Soumya Kanti Ghosh, because am I right in suggesting that India appears to be an oasis of stability in a turbulent neighborhood, despite the fact that today the RBI has once again suggested a dip in its growth forecast, 7.2% now for 22-23. Are we in a safe position, or are there warning signals also for us?
Yeah, thanks Rajdeep for having me on the show. I think, of course, there are challenges in the current geopolitical conflict, which has now played out for almost more than a month. And today's RBI policy statement that has lowered the growth forecast to 7.2% is actually a reflection of this conflict, because as all of us knows that there are estimates which I don't want to highlight, but for every $10 increase in the prices of crude, growth is impacted by around 15 to 16 basis points. So given the fact that crude has now decisively moved up to beyond 100, and the RBI assumes that $100 is the price of the crude, so that will already shave off around 30 to 40 basis points from 7.8%. So there, RBI has set the growth at 7.2%. But inflation, of course, will be a little higher in the next couple of months. Possibly for the next couple of months, it will stay over 6%. So that's the RBI limit. But for the full year also, the RBI inflation forecast is now 5.7% as against the 4.5%. So there are estimates that show that this inflation could again could be a little bit on the lower side. But having said that, I think even with this current inflation projections, which is now closer to the upper band, and a growth number which is now lower to 7%, I think with the kind of with the stability in the exchange rate, the external sector, the fiscal deficit, I think these numbers look reasonably well at this point of time. Of course, there will be an impact on the fiscal deficit. There will be an impact on the current account deficit, that's the external metrics. But even if we take all these factors into consideration, I think with the foreign exchange reserves, which is now well in excess of 600 billion, I think that will be sufficient to tide over any storm in the external sector. But we should remain watchful and careful,
Right.
because India cannot be insulated from the global economy as
But
was
we
the
are
case
in a better
many
place.
years back.
We are in a better place
Yes.
than our neighbors at the moment. Let me turn to our neighbors. As I said, this is a unique South Asian roundtable that we are trying to organize. Dr. Kadir Gamar, Sri Lanka at the moment is the one which appears by all accounts worse off. There is talk that you're running out of fuel. India has given you $1 billion for critical imports, a 400 million currency swap, 500 million credit line for fuels purchases that may well run out soon. How serious is the crisis at the moment? And do you hold it squarely responsible on pandemic followed by the war in Ukraine? Or is Sri Lanka in a sense an outlier at the moment?
The crisis here is quite serious. It's probably the worst crisis that we're going through since the 1930s. And it's showing everywhere in terms of people suffering, shortages of fuel, price hikes, shortages of cooking gas. Very essential foods are becoming unaffordable to people, including even rice. But the cause of this crisis, though immediately, obviously, the war in Ukraine and the global hike in commodity prices, including oil, have affected it. And in Sri Lanka's case, the pandemic, which led to lockdowns and a complete shutdown of our tourism sector, pushed us over. But I see this crisis as much longer in the making. Sri Lanka was the first country to liberalize its economy back in 1977, first country in South Asia. And it's a continuation of that, where we continue to liberalize trade, continue to liberalize the financial system. A lot of this is due to the excessive debt. We eventually got into a debt trap of borrowing in the international capital markets with sovereign bonds. And now, even as imports due to trade liberalization are over 80% over our exports, which we are unable to pay for, there's also the debt payments that we have to make periodically. Now, some of the debt, for example, owed to some of our bilateral donors like India, we are able to negotiate and extend it. But when it comes to the debt owed to capital markets in the form of sovereign bonds, there is actually the danger of Sri Lanka defaulting, which would really make it hard for us to be part of the global system and to continue to trade and have transactions. So this is a very serious situation.
And this has led to street protests. We'll play some of those shots of the kind of protests that we are seeing in Sri Lanka. But let's switch to what's happening in Pakistan also at a moment. It would appear, Dr. Haq, that while the immediate reason for what's gone wrong in Pakistan with Imran Khan is the role of the army, there's also, his battle with the army, which went horribly wrong. It was precipitated, many believe, by the economic crisis. When I look at your inflation numbers, in particular, double-digit inflation is something that very few governments can survive for an extended period of time. Would I be right in saying that particularly in the case of Pakistan, it is the inflationary spiral that the country has got into which is responsible for it? And what do you hold responsible for the crisis of the Pakistan economy today? I'll put up those numbers for Pakistan. Sir, you're on mute, sir. You have to unmute yourself, sir. You have to unmute yourself.
Apologies.
Yeah.
I don't think the crisis in Pakistan is a short-term crisis, and it's only a crisis of inflation. Pakistan, including Sri Lanka, I would say, we've all been in the midst of a long, stretched-out crisis. I worked in Sri Lanka for 3 years as the IMF rep. We pretend to have liberalized the economy, but we liberalized trade a little bit, and then we slap on regulatory duties. The internal economy has not been liberalized. We remain a heavily regulated economy, and I think it's the biggest problem is regulation. Related to the regulation, I think is a part of the South Asian legacy that all of us share. In that none of the South Asian countries have really liberalized the colonial economy. We still rely on the civil service. We still rely on the old colonial laws, which are heavily interventionist. And I think that crisis is bubbling all the time. We've been to the IMF 23 times in our history, which is almost twice every decade. Now, with that kind of an engagement with the IMF, you can be sure that we are not invoking a long-term configuration of the economy that is growth-friendly. So I think the biggest problem right now is, throughout our economy throughout our history has been that we have grown well below our potential. This is also illustrated in our unemployment numbers, which we have looked at recently. Our unemployment numbers, the recorded unemployment rate remains at 6%. But when we look deeper, unemployment of graduates, for example, is 31%. Unemployment of females is about 80%. So there's a huge amount of hidden unemployment. The graduate premium is very small. So we need to really liberalize our economy in a big way, dismantle the colonial system, put in a new modern system that works with the global economy. And if we don't, then of course we have all kinds of rhetoric to say that this happened.
Can I just stop you, Dr. Haq, for a moment, just to point out that in the early 1980s, actually Pakistan's per capita income was higher than India. And look at where we are today. Look at the dramatic change. In that sense, did Pakistan lose out and India captured the moment at the turn of the century? Today, India's exports, for example, are at a record high. Our balance of payments crisis, we were going to default in 1991. We are in a very, very solid position today when it comes to balance of payments. Inflation relatively under check at the moment in comparison to the neighborhood. Would you say India got a few things right, Dr. Haq, when it comes to liberalization in contrast to Pakistan?
I do agree with you that the Manmohan Ahluwalia team did liberalize the economy sufficiently and in a serious manner, but I think India still has a long way to go. I think all of us really have to begin to accept liberalization, and not just openness of the economy, but also internal liberalization. For example, we still have Section 144 that stops the movement of wheat. We still buy wheat. The government buys wheat, for example. The government protects the sugarcane industry. The government protects the car industry. The government protects the fertilizer industry. All this leads to very low productivity, and we've looked at our productivity. It has been declining over the last 2 decades.
You know, in a way, therefore, Soumya Kanti Ghosh, is India benefiting from the fact that a few hard decisions have been taken over the last 30 years? We could have taken some even harder decisions. Many believe that there are areas, Dr. Ghosh, where we could have done much more. There are areas where we haven't liberalized fast enough. There are others who will, the skeptics who will say that maybe, there are people, when you look at poverty line figures, extreme poverty has declined sharply in India over the last 2 decades. Do you believe that we could do more than we are doing at the moment in a way to stave ourselves from this increasingly globalized, hyper-connected economy?
I think, Rajdeep, I'll just give an example over here before I answer your question. For example, the recent geopolitical conflict with Ukraine and Russia has actually worked wonders for opportunity for a country like India. If you look into the numbers of India, Russia, and China, they control 22% of the global GDP and 16% of the exports of goods and services. So I think there is always an element of opportunity in any challenges we say. And as far as your specific question of whether we could have done some reforms more, yes, we could have done some reforms more. For example, the most important reforms which possibly could have done more is the agricultural sector, because of price regulations, there has been no element of price discovery. And that has been one of the problems. The government tried to address that, but because of political compulsions, that was not able to be carried through. Apart from that one, I think also in the India, as you know, has a large system of public sector banks, which actually has worked to the advantage of the Indian financial sector. Because when we had this crisis, the Asian crisis and the global financial crisis, the Indian financial sector was largely unimpacted because the Indian banking sector has a large majority of the PSBs. But there are reforms which you could even do in the financial sector. There are some reforms which you can do in the agricultural sector. We have been trying to carry forward these reforms, but now I think the time has come, possibly, to try to ensure that there is at least a consensus of the crucial reforms across the political class, so that we can carry on the reforms irrespective of the noise which it creates in the system.
You know, Dr. Kadir Gamar, we talk about reforms. Now, Sri Lanka, on the other hand, as you said, was the first to liberalize out of these three South Asian countries that we are speaking out. But you're looking at Bangladesh today, and Bangladesh is registering, unfortunately, our Bangladesh guest couldn't join us today, but Bangladesh growth projection 2022 6.9%, second only to India. So Bangladesh is one of the big success stories in a way of the last decade in particular. Where do you think Sri Lanka has gone wrong in comparison to the other South Asian countries, Bangladesh being an example of a country which 20 years ago many thought was a country in serious trouble?
I must say I tend to disagree with my co-panelists from India and Pakistan. If you take Sri Lanka's case, in the 1970s, we were considered a model development state. Even though our per capita income was low, we had very high human development indicators. To this day, when you take literacy, when you take health, even if you take electrification of the country, 99% of the country and even our rural folk are electrified. I would argue that it's actually liberalization. We've gone through 16 IMF agreements, most recently in 2016, and then before that in 2009. It's liberalization that has actually aggravated the crisis, where we open up our markets. Obviously, a country like Sri Lanka cannot compete on the scale that India or Pakistan produces when it comes to agricultural trade liberalization. That has decimated our agricultural sector, and now we are facing a food crisis. The last 4 decades, if you look at it, liberalization has led to periodic and increased and deeper financial crises all over the world. I would argue that actually the rest of South Asia should look at Sri Lanka, that there is a danger that it's not as rosy a picture. We are seeing, even coming out of the COVID, a K-type of recovery where the wealthier countries, the developed world is doing much better. The developing world is heading south, and we should really maybe, in my view, Sri Lanka might be the front runner. We were the front runner in terms of liberalization, and we might be the front runner in terms of a crisis.
Let me though press a pause button on what you said. It's contentious what you've just said, that you believe actually liberalization worked against the interests of Sri Lanka. There'll be many who will disagree, I'm sure. Nadimul Haq will. Look at Vietnam, on the other hand. Opened up its economy, and Vietnam is today one of the prime emerging markets across the world. So there are different case studies across the world. Nadimul Haq, you want to dive into that? Do you believe that this moment is one for the countries of South Asia to liberalize and reform even faster? Or, as Dr. Kadir Gamar is saying, to press that pause button and be a little conscious of not falling into the kind of debt trap that today Lanka finds itself in?
I think, quite frankly, this debate on whether to liberalize or not liberalize is kind of old, and we don't need to get into it. I think looking at the experience of China, India, and many other countries, what we see is that it's how you run the economy that's important. You have to configure the state, and you have to truly... Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so the point is that if we can truly configure the state, figure out a strategy on how to move forward. For example, you can't just liberalize without thought. And the second thing, most important thing that most developing countries have done is liberalized, but kept the old system going. So we liberalize with the colonial system in place. We liberalize with the old system, bureaucracy in place. We liberalize with old laws in place. Obviously, there's going to be a crisis. We have to take the wholesale approach that China has taken, a strategic approach, not a doctrinaire approach, where you ensure that you are going to make a state that is in keeping with your needs. You're going to make clever policy. You're going to experiment with policy. You're going to make mistakes. But your true north is that you have to develop your country, you have to create jobs, you have to create employment, you have to create growth. Now, if you have that kind of a pragmatic approach, you can grow. But if you just say, oh, I'm going to liberalize this, I'm not going to liberalize that, then there's a problem. Sri Lanka liberalized, yes.
Is part of the problem the politics of South Asia, though, Professor Haq? The politics of South Asia, large-scale corruption, large-scale cronyism, that prevents genuine reform, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's India, whether it's Sri Lanka. In all these three countries, the one common factor that is often held out against these three countries is rampant cronyism that still continues.
I don't agree on that. I think there's cronyism in the US too. There's cronyism in every country. So that doesn't matter. What matters is competence. I think we pay too little attention to competence. We pay too little attention to the fact that policy requires thought, research, consensus building, and many difficult things that China and Singapore and many countries have done. We don't believe in that. Secondly, I think that's also something that we have to worry about. We also tend to put ourselves at hostage to the donors. The donors, the international economic hitmen who come here, I used to be one of them, and who come and give you policy, they have nothing to lose. I have nothing to lose what I left Sri Lanka with. So, unfortunately, people in the country have to take ownership of their own country. And they have to develop policy with thought and care, and not just follow the Geneva Convention or the Puerto Rico Convention or this convention or that or the SDGs. We follow too much. We don't innovate enough.
Okay,
we need to move forward to innovation.
Let me therefore ask you all very quickly and 30-second answers, starting with you, Soumyakanti Ghosh. Do you believe a year from now, given what we've seen happening over the last few weeks and no sense that there no clear idea whether this Russia-Ukraine war will end in a hurry, will India be in a better place in January of 2023, or are there headwinds that we should be worried about?
No, I think, Rajdeep, India is in a much better place as of now. Yes, there are challenges, as we have seen in the geopolitical conflict that we have just said. And one point which I'd like to emphasize over here, as my co-panelists also have been saying, this liberalization is actually a continuous process, and this has to be taken to suit what suits the country fine. Because there are examples galore of success of liberalization and failures of liberalization, but it must be specific to the country. So my sense is that Indian economy, even though it faces some challenges, but there are enough opportunities in the next fiscal. If you look into the numbers of capacity utilization, which has been released by RBI today, they are now more than 70%. So possibly a quick end to the conflict could initiate more front-loaded recovery for a country like India.
Okay. Dr. Kadir Gaman, will Sri Lanka be in a better place a year from now? Could this year of turbulence be Sri Lanka's wake-up call in a way as it was in 1991 with India?
Sadly, I think Sri Lanka is caught in a much longer crisis. What we have seen is, along with liberalization, inequality in the country consistently increase. And what we are seeing out on the street, people's anger is towards those kinds of policies. So if you're only concerned about growth and not social and human development, then at some point we're going to see a lot more people out on the street trying to change the system. The way the system is unraveling, I think we are going to look at a different kind of social contract. From time to time, in the 1940s, in the 1970s, Sri Lanka went through a different social contract. And this might be a time when we again move towards a different social contract, a different paradigm altogether, where people are going to insist on the social welfare that they deserve for the amount of labor and work that they put in.
Dr. Haq, a final word from you. Will Pakistan emerge stronger, you believe, from this year or 3 years now of turbulence, 2 years of the pandemic? Now we've got the Russia-Ukraine war, or is the country on notice in a way?
I think two things I'd like to say on that. One is that Pakistan will recover. Pakistan always recovers very sharply and will recover. But the problem is it will not recover to its potential, because unless we make the deep-rooted changes, and I don't think we have the political consensus to do that. The second thing I'd say about the whole of South Asia that also is important is it's not just the Russia-Ukraine headwinds that are coming. There are many more headwinds coming in the future. There's a large amount of technological and financial changes that are coming that we'll all have to face. Unless we have the strategy and the cleverness and the wherewithal to face it, we will be beholden to the international community and we will be passive players. Unfortunately, we've always been passive players. India is slightly more active than us, but the rest of us are passive players and we get hurt because we are too passive, less strategic and less proactive.
Well, all I can say is that it's wonderful to have three of you on a round table. We wish we had our representatives from Bangladesh and Nepal as well. Maybe we'll do that in the next few weeks, because this crisis is not going anywhere. It will require us to constantly, in a way, monitor the state of our economies. And I'm glad that we've been able to put this together and, in a way, kickstart these important debates on the real issues of our times. Thank you all very much for joining me here on the News Today. As I said, we will continuously focus on what we believe are the real issues that need to be debated on prime time in this country. And the economy is top of those issues.